Large-scale quilt blocks come together on point to create a dynamic quilt in this episode of My First Quilt. Hi there, welcome to My First Quilt. I'm your host, Sara, and in this episode we are creating the Cross It Out quilt. Now this is a really striking quilt. There are only 4 main fabrics, 1 background, and then 1 accent that you see just a little bit throughout the quilt. And it's a lot of fun to put together. I really enjoyed making this. Now let's take a look at what the actual block in this quilt is. We can see that right here is our block, and I've got one stitched just to kind of show you where it comes together. So you're going to be creating this block in blue and in purple, and then the way that we put it together and the sashings that we add to it really create several different motifs throughout the quilt. So you've got your main block here, you end up with kind of a secondary block right here, and then if I slide it forward, and you can see here that this pattern also emerges. It almost looks like a flower to me. So I love putting together quilts like this where with one basic unit and then some sashings, you end up with 3 very predominant kind of motifs throughout the quilt. So I can't wait to show you how this comes together. So here I've got the blue portion of the quilt block, and now we're going to create the purple. You've got several of the blue and several of the purple. We're making the exact same block, just with its contrasting color. And it all starts with squares. We're basically doing a giant stitch and flip. So here I've got my base square and 2 smaller squares, and one at a time I want to add these. And I've marked my line because this is a much larger square for me, so I wouldn't want to eyeball stitching diagonally point to point. So I've got my piece in position, and now I'm going to stitch from corner to corner to add this unit to the corner of my background square. So here's that first portion sewn on, and now we are going to trim that off just like this. Whoop, 1/4 inch, not a 1/2 inch. There we go, just like that. So we do end up with kind of a large piece of scrap, and I'll show you on the next side something that I did with all those scraps. So I'm going to give this a quick press. We want to make sure that we press it before we add the next piece on so that everything lays nice and flat. And now I'm ready to add the second square, placing it right in the corner, and once again we'll stitch from point to point. And there we have it. Now before I cut this off, I want to show you something that I did. Because we have so much excess that we're trimming off here, usually on a stitch and flip block, we're working on smaller pieces and you're just cutting off little small triangles. But because this is kind of an enlarged block, you end up with quite a bit of waste. So I stitched on the other side and then cut between my 2 lines and ended up with a whole bunch of excess half square triangle units. So I'm lining it up so that the edge of my foot is along my stitching line. So I've got a fairly decent seam allowance here, and I'm just going to stitch right along. You can always measure a second line to stitch exactly a 1/2 inch away if you want to. But I didn't worry about it because this is just kind of a bonus project. So now I'm going to cut right between my 2 lines, and I'm darn close to a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each of those. And then you're left with all of these extra half square triangles. Now, it is a little bit more sewing because you're doing double the stitching on each one of those units, but you've got a lot of half square triangles to use for another project. We can set those aside. Okay, so now I'm going to press that seam open, or really just toward the white side. Good. And now we get to build another portion of this unit. So we're going to start with a white triangle to place on each side of the piece, just like this. And I like to lay it out as I go because it helps me to kind of visualize the direction that all of the pieces need to go. And then we're going to be placing one of our light blue pieces like this and like that. And we do want to make sure, that's the wrong side of the fabric, kind of hard to tell with the batik, but we'll try to get it right there. We do want to make sure that we have kind of an A and a B, or a left and a right side. They're not exactly the same. They're a mirror image of each other. And that's why I like to kind of lay it out as I go. So now I'm going to just place one over top of the other and stitch that with a 1/4 inch seam, and then I'll move on to the second little wing unit here. Now all that's left to do is to create the tip of the triangle in our triangle block here, and I've got a trick for you on that. Now I like to, with the right sides out, fold my block in half like this, and then just give myself a nice little finger crease right where the center of that purple portion is at. And then I'm going to take my triangle point and right sides out, fold it in half as well. I'm lining up the tips of my triangle, there we go, and give a little finger press. And then place fold to fold. Because we folded right sides out, this puts our right sides together. You could insert a little pin if you want. And then I'm going to open up both of my folds, just kind of holding them together. And that is a quick, easy way to make sure that this center triangle, or this point, is centered on the rest of the block. And now we stitch. Now that that portion is done, it's time to add the other half of our block. And that is the blue half. So here it is. So you're literally going to just place these right on top of each other. And for this step, it's not a bad idea to use a couple of pins just to hold everything together, because you do want to try and keep all of those white triangle points nice and together. I'm going to just kind of wing it here and stitch it. But when you're working on this at home, make sure that you put a couple of pins in for this step. So here is our completed block. You're going to give this a really good press, and then you're ready to start constructing the quilt. I'm going to pull the quilt back up again so I can show you how it looks when we place this block and the sashing strips in. Now it's a little bit difficult to tell by looking at the quilt, but this is actually set on point, and it all starts in this top corner here. We've got one very small sashing strip that matches this part of our sashing strip, and you do have some places where you use just a half of your block, not the full block with the purple and the blue sewn together, and that's how the quilt begins. So here we have just two of our purple halves separated by a sashing strip, and it's called cross it out because you do have kind of an X that goes through the quilt, and it's created by those sashing pieces. So if I slide it forward a little further here, we can see that we've got this main sashing strip, and here we start introducing some of the actual full-sized blocks. So here is our first full block, and this is where we start to introduce the second sashing color. We've got a lighter purple, and in between your sashing strips there are some little hourglass units that you stitch, just so that it kind of flows together, all those different sashing pieces in between the darker purple and the lighter purple. And then we've got this green highlight square that ends up in the center of when your four colored blocks come together. So again, you've got a couple of different patterns going on in this quilt as it comes to life, as it's created. Lots of things emerge, and it all goes together in diagonally set rows, and then you can build out to the corner to make it square. Now, because of the fact that it goes together in rows like that, it's a little bit more challenging to modify the size of this. This is a queen-sized quilt, and it doesn't even call for any borders. It's just a big queen-sized quilt with all of those blocks, and it's a lot of fun to make. I hope that you've enjoyed learning about the stitch and flip technique and how to make these big blocks to create this beautiful quilt. Come back and see me again on My First Quilt. My First Quilt is brought to you by Baby Lock, Free Spirit Fabrics, Madeira, and Hobbs Batting.